That morning, the courtroom felt colder than it should. The air held the sterile scent of wood polish and tension, like even the walls were waiting to take sides. Cameras clicked somewhere behind me, their flashes reflecting off the brass nameplate that read, Judge Ruth O'Connor, my mother's friend. Of course, Councilwoman Elaine Rivers sat across the aisle, her posture rehearsed, her chin lifted with political grace. Beside her, Patrick Rivers, my father, avoided my gaze, as if guilt could be disguised as silence. Her attorney arranged documents with the calm of someone who already believed victory was inevitable. Then came the words that pierced deeper than any legal claim. This girl only knows how to waste what she doesn't deserve. Drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever had to stand alone in a room full of people who wanted to see you fail? I want to hear your story. I was never meant to be the subject of the portrait. I was the negative space, the shadow that made the light look brighter. Growing up in the suffocating elegance of Beacon Hill, I learned early on that affection in our house wasn't given. It was curated. My mother, Cynthia, treated her life like a gallery exhibition, and I was the piece that didn't quite fit the theme. She was the chairwoman of the arts board, a woman who could appraise the value of a painting from across the room but couldn't see the value of her own daughter unless I was useful. Usefulness, for me, meant being the contrast, the disappointment. I remember the first time I understood my role. I was 12. Cynthia was hosting a fundraiser for the museum, a black tie affair with champagne that cost more than most people's cars. I had spent weeks trying to paint something for her, a clumsy watercolor of the harbor. I wanted her to see me. I wanted to be like her. When I brought it downstairs, she didn't yell. Cynthia never yelled. Yelling was vulgar. Instead, she took the painting, smiled a thin, pitying smile, and turned to her guests. "Oh, look at this," she said, her voice chiming like expensive crystal. "Poor Eden. She tries so hard, doesn't she? It's a shame she doesn't have the eye. But we love her anyway for trying." The guests laughed. A soft, polite ripple of amusement. I stood there, freezing in my taffeta dress, while my mother used my failure as a charming anecdote to warm up the crowd. That was the moment the invisible chain snapped into place. I wasn't just ignored. I was conditioned. I learned that my role was to be the prop in her tragedy of maternal patience. If I succeeded, I threatened her narrative. If I failed, I validated it. So I learned to be quiet. I learned to be still. I learned to exist only within the frame she had built for me. My grandmother, Catherine, was the only one who saw the person behind the prop. Her studio was everything our house wasn't. Messy, vibrant, smelling of turpentine and dust. She didn't care about provenance or market value. She cared about the truth of a line, the honesty of a color. When I was with her, I wasn't a failed sketch. I was just Eden. She taught me how to look at things, really look at them. How to see the layers beneath the varnish. How to spot a forgery not by the paint, but by the hesitation in the brushstroke. She told me once, while we were stretching canvas, that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves to survive. "You're not weak, Eden," she said, her hands stained with Prussian blue. "You're observant. And in a house full of mirrors, the one who watches is the one who holds the power." I didn't believe her then. I thought power belonged to the people who held the gavel or the checkbook. I didn't know yet that power could also be found in a filing cabinet. When Catherine got sick, the dynamic shifted. Cynthia didn't mourn. She calculated. I spent my days at the hospice, reading to my grandmother, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Cynthia spent her days with lawyers and appraisers. She was already mentally cataloging Catherine's estate, deciding which pieces would go to auction and which would hang in the new museum wing she planned to name after herself. The Cynthia Wing. A monument to her own vanity built on her mother's legacy. The day Catherine died, the air in the room felt heavy, charged with the electricity of a storm about to break. Her lawyer, Mr. Henderson, read the will in the library of our Beacon Hill home. The room was lined with first editions that Cynthia had never opened. I sat in the corner, trying to make myself small. Cynthia sat in the center, poised, ready to accept her inheritance as her due. "I leave my entire estate, including the liquid assets of $24 million and the control of the Emerging Artists Trust, to my granddaughter Eden." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was violent. Cynthia didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply turned to look at me, her eyes cold and assessing, like I was a painting she had just discovered was a fake. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice flat. "Mother wasn't in her right mind. Eden can't manage a trust. She can barely manage her own life. That was the opening shot. The war didn't start with guns. It started with whispers. Within a week, my mother had launched a campaign that would make a politician blush. She didn't attack me directly. That would be gauche. Instead, she leveraged her social capital. At gallery openings, charity luncheons, board meetings, she dropped hints. Subtle, concerned comments about my mental stability. "I'm just so worried about Eden," she would say, touching a diamond necklace that had belonged to Catherine. "She's been so fragile since Mother passed. I don't think she understands the burden of this legacy. We're trying to protect her from herself." And they believed her. Course they did. The art world is a small, incestuous ecosystem where reputation is currency. Cynthia was the gold standard. I was the counterfeit. I started receiving emails from board members suggesting I step down. Invitations to events I had attended for years suddenly stopped coming. I was being erased, not with malice, but with concern. It was at a private viewing for a new exhibition that I saw the true scope of the battlefield. I wasn't invited, of course, but as the executor of the estate, I had to be there to sign off on some loan agreements. I stood by the catering table, invisible as always. Across the room, Cynthia was holding court. Beside her stood Judge Rebecca. I knew her. Everyone knew her. She was a fixture in Beacon Hill, elegant, formidable, the kind of woman whose approval could make a career. They were whispering, heads close together. Cynthia laughed, a sound that didn't reach her eyes, and touched the judge's arm. It was a gesture of familiarity, of shared secrets. The judge nodded, her expression serious but complicit. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the gallery's climate control. This wasn't just social maneuvering. This was infrastructure. They weren't just friends. They were allies in a siege. And I was the city they intended to starve out. That night I went back to my apartment. It wasn't much, just a quiet space filled with books and the few sketches I had kept. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the legal threats Cynthia's lawyers had already started sending. They claimed undue influence. They claimed incompetence. They were going to drag me through every court in Massachusetts until I broke or went bankrupt. I looked at the stack of papers. I thought about Catherine. I thought about the young artist she wanted to help, the ones Cynthia would dismiss as bad investments. And I realized something. I couldn't win this by being Eden the daughter. I couldn't win by crying or begging or trying to prove I was worthy of their love. That currency had no value here. I had to become something else. I had to become Eden the archivist. My profession wasn't glamorous. It was about order. It was about preservation. It was about tracing the line from A to B and proving that it existed. Cynthia cared about the image. I cared about the provenance. If she wanted a war over legacy, I would give her one. But I wouldn't fight with rumors. I would fight with records. I stopped answering her calls. I stopped trying to defend myself to her friends. I went dark. I became a gray rock, uninteresting, unresponsive, while privately I started digging. I hired a forensic accountant, a man named Marcus who usually worked on corporate fraud cases. I told him I wanted to audit the provenance of my mother's life. Find the gaps, I told him. Find the brushstrokes that don't match. For weeks we lived in spreadsheets. Bank statements, tax returns, charitable donation logs. It was tedious, unglamorous work. It was the opposite of the art world's flash. But patterns began to emerge. Small discrepancies. A donation here that didn't quite align with a gala date. A transfer there to a vendor that didn't seem to exist. It wasn't a smoking gun. Not yet. It was just noise. But noise, if you listen closely enough, eventually resolves into a frequency. I spent my nights cross-referencing guest lists with board appointments. I built a timeline of Cynthia's rise to power, overlaying it with the judge's career milestones. Then late one Tuesday Marcus called me. His voice was tight. "Eden," he said, "I think you need to see this." I went to his office. On his screen was a scanned image of a gala program from 5 years ago. It was for the Art and Justice Charity Ball, an event Cynthia had chaired. I remembered it. It was the night she had worn a red dress and told me I looked sensible in my black one. "Look at the benefactor list," Marcus said. I leaned in. There, in the list of platinum benefactors, people who had donated over $50,000, was a name I didn't recognize. The Phoenix Trust. "I've never heard of them," I said. "Neither had I," Marcus replied. So I looked them up. "It's a shell company, Eden. Registered in Delaware. No employees. No office. Just a P.O. box. But here's the interesting part. Look who sits on the board. He clicked a file. My breath hitched. There were 3 names listed. 2 were lawyers I didn't know. The third was Rebecca Sterling. Judge Rebecca. And here's the kicker, Marcus said, opening another window. This trust received a transfer of $750,000 from your mother's personal account 3 days before this gala. I stared at the screen. The numbers blurred. $750,000. That wasn't a donation. That was a salary. That was a bribe disguised as philanthropy. My mother hadn't just bought a judge's friendship. She had bought a judge. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just about being mean. This wasn't just about narcissism. This was a crime. It was embezzlement and bribery, documented in glossy print in a program that hundreds of people had held in their hands and then thrown away. They were so arrogant. They were so convinced of their own untouchability that they had printed their crimes on heavy cardstock and handed them out as souvenirs. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was clarity. Cold, sharp, crystalline clarity. I wasn't the failed prop anymore. I was the curator of their destruction. I took the files. I organized them. I printed copies. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I had a court date. Cynthia wanted a show. I would give her a show. But this time she wouldn't be the one directing it. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. No more trying to blend in. I wore a suit that was tailored and sharp. Pulled my hair back. I looked like someone who managed millions, not someone who asked for an allowance. When I walked into that courtroom, the air was stifling. The wood paneling seemed to absorb the light. Cynthia was already there, looking tragic and brave in a designer suit that probably cost more than my car. She whispered something to her lawyer, then looked at me with that familiar mix of pity and disdain. Judge Rebecca entered. The room stood. She looked down at us from the bench, her face a mask of impartial authority. I wondered if she knew. I wondered if she remembered the Phoenix Trust, or if it was just one of many streams of income she had laundered through her reputation. The proceedings began. Cynthia's lawyer painted a picture of a concerned mother trying to save a family legacy from an unstable daughter. He used words like stewardship and tradition. He talked about the museum wing. He talked about Cynthia's years of service to the arts. When it was my turn, I didn't make a speech. I didn't appeal to emotion. I stood up. I picked up the folder on my table. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady. Before we proceed with the arguments regarding my mental state, I would like to submit evidence regarding the financial stewardship of the estate's assets. I walked to the bench. The bailiff moved to stop me, but I slid the papers across the mahogany before he could intervene. The gala program. The bank transfer records. The corporate registration for the Phoenix Trust. I watched Judge Rebecca's face. I watched as she glanced at the papers. I saw the exact moment the blood drained from her skin. It wasn't a dramatic gasp. It was a twitch. A small, involuntary tremor in her hand as she reached for her water glass. Her eyes darted to Cynthia, then back to the papers. Cynthia frowned, confused by the shift in the room's energy. She didn't know yet. She didn't know that the frame she had built was about to collapse. I spoke again, pitching my voice so that every person in the gallery could hear. This document shows a transfer of $750,000 from my mother's account to a trust where you, Your Honor, serve as a board member. This transfer occurred 3 days before a gala where you were honored. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the air. It was the sound of a vacuum being created, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Cynthia stood up. That's irrelevant. That's charity. Is it? I asked, turning to her. Or is it the price of admission? Judge Rebecca cleared her throat. Sounded like a gunshot. Her hands were shaking now, visible to everyone. She tried to compose herself, to summon the authority of her robes, but the mask had cracked. The varnish had peeled away, revealing the rot underneath. I am recusing myself from this case, she stammered. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual resonance. Due to a potential conflict of interest. The gallery erupted. Reporters who had been dozing in the back row were suddenly typing furiously. Cynthia looked from the judge to me, her expression fracturing from confusion to horror. She realized, finally, that I hadn't been hiding. I had been hunting. I walked back to my table and sat down. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just watched them crumble. It was a quiet kill. A demolition conducted with paper and patience. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and brutal. Judge Rebecca resigned within 48 hours, citing health reasons, but the investigation by the ethics committee was already front-page news. Cynthia was asked to step down from the arts board. The museum quietly cancelled the plans for the Cynthia wing. Her social calendar, once so full she had to turn down invitations, became a blank slate. I took possession of the estate. The $24 million. The collection. But the first thing I did wasn't to buy a new house or a new wardrobe. I went to Catherine's old studio. I opened the windows and let the light in. I used the money to establish the Catherine Fund. Not for a building. Not for a monument. But for grants. Grants for artists who were too raw, too experimental, too unpolished for the Beacon Hill galleries. I turned the carriage house of the estate into a workspace for them. Standing there, watching a young painter attack a canvas with a ferocity that reminded me of my grandmother, I felt a shift. The anger that had fueled me for months began to ebb, leaving behind a clean, quiet space. I wasn't the girl who waited for permission anymore. I wasn't the prop. I was the patron. I walked over to a mirror that leaned against the wall. I looked at my reflection. I saw the lines of fatigue, yes, but I also saw the strength. I saw the eyes of someone who had looked at the ugly truth and hadn't blinked. I picked up a camera I had bought with my own money. I pointed it at the mirror and took a photo. Self-portrait. Uncurated. Unvarnished. Real. Because in the end, the only provenance that matters is the one you write for yourself. If you've ever had to rewrite your own story after someone else tried to edit you out, share this video. Let's remind the world that the truth always finds a way to the surface.